One of the most important elements in any game is its story. After all, there needs to be context behind actions in order for them to make sense. So, with better conveyed context, there will be a better understanding of the events in a game. So, with that being said, let's talk about Pressure and Doors. These are both survival horror games on Roblox which involve you, the player, traversing through several rooms to avoid a bunch of monsters and threats. However, something which both of these games have is a story. Much like other games, there is a story which you, the player, follows, as well as an underlying narrative which explains the environment you are faced with. Now, despite both Doors and Pressure being very similar in terms of gameplay, their stories, more specifically how they are told, are drastically different. And this is what I want to discuss today. In this video, we'll be looking at the methods of how both Doors and Pressure tell their stories, and we'll be looking at the pros and cons of each method. Now, something very important to note is that this video won't be attempting to prove one method is better than the other. We will just be looking at how they differ. So, with all of that being said, let's begin. Alrighty, so the main difference between Doors and Pressure's stories are the way they are told. More specifically, the story of Doors is told indirectly, whereas Pressure's story is told directly. What I mean by this is that Doors presents its story mainly through showing, whereas Pressure presents its story through telling. A good example of this would be the ending of each game. In Doors, after the final boss fight, you are met with a cutscene which shows the player falling into the mines, being followed by said boss, implying that we'll meet them later on. In Pressure, after completing the game, we are met with some dialogue which explains how you, the player, hand over the crystal you had retrieved from the facility, and how you are now pardoned and no longer a prisoner. There are pros and cons of both indirect and direct storytelling, which I will discuss now. Let's start with direct storytelling, which is the method Pressure uses. One of the main devices used to portray the lore of the game are documents. Documents are collectibles which can be discovered through finding artifacts or encountering threats. Each document contains and clearly explains the information on how whatever it's talking about is relevant to the overall story of the game. Take for example the document which explains the Let Van Zone. This is a region in the ocean which for some reason doesn't experience the intense physical pressure typically found deep underwater, which is why the Black Site, aka the facility where the gameplay takes place in, was built there. Just from the writing in this document alone, we are able to clearly understand and interpret this entire lore of the region. And many other supernatural aspects of the game can also concisely be understood by reading their documents. This in turn leads me to point out the first benefit of direct storytelling, that being that it is easy to pick up and understand. In fact, many people, including the developer of Pressure themselves, don't know that Doors even has an underlying narrative due to how hidden away it is, which could be considered a con of indirect storytelling, which is much harder to interpret. However, this aspect of being easily accessible can just as easily harm as it helps. You see, part of the charm about any story is trying to figure out connections and reveals on your own, and in the case of direct storytelling, this is quite limited, largely due to how all of the information is told to you up front. I think a really good example of how Doors uses indirect storytelling is with the multiple context clues used to prove the existence of the third red light. This is a character who has never been mentioned or revealed formally. However, we are able to determine that they are actually real as well as what their motives are based on clues in the game, such as the Room 60 painting. So, although indirect storytelling is better for allowing players to understand the lore of the game, direct storytelling is better for allowing players to figure things out for themselves. Another benefit of indirect storytelling is that it allows players to better visualize and understand major events within the game. After all, knowing the key plot points well allows you to perceive their outcomes much better. A good comparison would be with certain events relating to Guiding Light from Doors and Sebastian from Pressure. In Doors, we're told Guiding Light is the only thing which helps us on our journey, and we can see this in-game. Guiding Light saves us from being killed by the figure by distracting them, and we can see this in the entity's introductory cutscene. In this clip, we can see the entity rush towards us, before changing course due to Guiding Light breaking a lamp. Physically seeing the danger figure presents as well as how we are saved by Guiding Light allows players to see just how much danger we were just in, as well as how Guiding Light is really the only thing stopping us from meeting our demise. In Pressure, we are told via Sebastian's document that he is the one who is responsible for all the monsters running free in the Black Site, causing the shutdown which results in the events of the game. Although this is an extremely important event, and the document does a really good job at explaining exactly what happened, not being able to physically see it go down definitely hinders the emotional effects it has on the player. This could be considered a case of showing is better than telling, however it isn't as simple as that. Lastly, a benefit with direct storytelling, and this is especially showcased with the way Pressure uses it, is that it can actually be used to create a completely new gameplay loop. You see, with indirect storytelling, you are typically going to experience the lore throughout playing the game. For example, indoors, we are mostly able to learn about events and characters just by normally playing, and this is fairly typical. We don't have to go out of our way to learn about the lore separately, and although this can be good to a certain degree, it can be changed to add another layer of complexity to the base experience. With Pressure's document system, players are given another goal after completing the main game, and that is to collect every document and learn about their contents. This creates an entirely new challenge which, in all honesty, after I've played it for a while, is pretty fun. Pressure was able to make its story tie into the gameplay perspective, which I see to be really difficult if you were working with an indirect story rather than a direct one. Anyways, that was essentially the whole video. I know there are definitely a lot more points I could have made, but these were just some of the basic ones which came to mind. Like I'd stated at the beginning of this video, one method of storytelling isn't better than the other, and it largely depends on the game to determine which method will work better. I personally believe indirect storytelling works better for Doors, as the lore of that game is very linear. There are only two stories being told, one of the player and the underlying narrative, which is fairly typical for most pieces of media. With Pressure, however, there are multiple distinct stories being told. Each character and entity has their own separate lore, which is all brought together in the game. In this sense, I believe direct storytelling works better for Pressure, as it is much better for handling multiple differing pieces of information. So with all of that being said, let me know in the comments what you think of these methods of storytelling. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching and I hope you enjoyed.